Good afternoon, friends. This is Dean Stevens. I am a longtime member of Community Church of Boston and presently serving as administrator and music director. I want to welcome you to this remembrance and observance and tribute to Bob Datilio. We have here an altar spread out for Bob that is under the beloved plaque that Bob was so instrumental in getting to have its home here at Community Church. And so such a perfect place for it, as they are our martyr patron saints. In 1920 was when Community Church was born. And it was soon after that that one of our very first events, social events, was a Sacco Vanzetti dinner. This was a church born with a new idea about religion and about what church should be. We have 50-year involvement with Bob all the way back to 1971. There are articles in our archives that Bob wrote about Sacco Vanzetti, about this plaque, about the case. And Bob was here, although not an attending member, he was here whenever the words Sacco and Vanzetti were stated. The most recently was a symposium just past August that you can find on our YouTube channel, where Bob delivered one of the addresses in this symposium on Sacco Vanzetti. I want to light a candle for Bob on this altar, which has not only the plaque, but it also has an anarchist flag. It has a picture of Bob, and it has Bob's ashes, as well as a photograph of his beloved Tina Modotti on the wall there, that famous hammer and sickle upon the Mexican farmer's hat. And this is to Bob. Long may he live, and thank you, Bob, for what you did for us. I got fire, and I'm going to light a match. Finally, I want to say that I really hope that this turns into a physical event at some point. It has been an incredible honor and privilege to meet and converse and have friendships with a host of people who called the church and talked to us about Bob and different aspects of his life and his many, many friendships. So all of you out there, please stay in touch, and we will announce a real physical event where, among other things, we will figure out where we will spread those ashes in the most beloved places of Bob and of his wife, Carol Ann, who, as you know, passed away about 12 years ago, and he grieved her all the time. With that, I want to hand this event over to Sergio Reyes of the Sacco Vanzetti Commemoration Society, with whom Bob worked hand in hand for many, many years to place Sacco and Vanzetti live in front in the memory of the city of Boston. We are so honored to have all of you, the speakers and all the rest of you. And Sergio is joining us from the southernmost point of that skinny little finger of a country called Chile, Punta Arenas, Chile. We are so honored to have him. Sergio, while he lived in Boston, presented many times here at the church, and both music and delivery of, especially around Latin America. Sergio, we're so honored to have you, and take it away as the MC for this event. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon to everybody, the good men and women of the United States present here today. We are going to have a full program today, maybe a couple of hours. And I'm just going to beg you to be disciplined and self-disciplined to try to move through this program so that we can go through the end of it successfully. We are going to begin the program with a slideshow and music that was prepared by Michele Fazio, and with pictures by Michele herself, Jerry Kaplan, and myself from Bob, to remember him in his many facets in the political arena. And the music actually was recorded by Bob's personal friend, Pat Zoffreo. Osorio. Professor Dukakis is the longest serving governor of Massachusetts in history, actually. He was nominated by the Democratic Party for the President of the United States in 1988 for the election of the year. On August 23, 1977, on the 50th anniversary of the executions of Sacco and Vanzetti, Governor Dukakis issued a proclamation declaring the date Nicola Sacco and Bartolomeo Vanzetti Memorial Day. Governor Dukakis, go ahead, please.
Thank you, Sergio. I'll try to keep this brief because we've got lots of speakers and lots of good ones, and I want to make sure that you have a chance to listen to and meet all of them. I was very much interested in politics from a very early age. That time I was 9 or 10. My parents were Greek immigrants. They'd come over to this country. My dad from a predominantly Greek town in Western Turkey, my mother from Central Greece. And they weren't political activists, but they were people that were aware and made sure their kids were aware of what was going on in the world. But I think I first got deeply and actively involved in the Sacco Vanzetti case as a young legislator. I'd gone to Swarthmore College down in Philadelphia, was in the Army most of my time in Korea from 1955 to 57, came back to Boston in 1957 and began at law school. And there was a wonderful young, dynamic Ilo-American named Alexander Cella, Al Cella, who was a special assistant at that time, I believe, to one of the speakers. And he was particularly interested in doing something that would exonerate officially Sacco and Vanzetti after that horrible trial and efforts to free them and what happened, which was ultimately their execution for a crime they never committed. And I met Al for the first time there and worked with him closely. I was, again, a law student and an intern, and I had organized a group of Harvard Law School students as interns to folks in the legislature, and Al was the guy that I worked with. And so working with Al Cella, I began to learn a lot about that case. I certainly had heard about it, needless to say, and got deeply and actively involved just as a young law student. Fast forward, and I become the governor of Massachusetts. And it seemed to me, this was in 1977, as I recall, it seemed to me that this would be a wonderful opportunity, first to call attention again to the case, and secondly, to do something to recognize the injustice that was involved in that case and their execution. And so in 1977, as I recall, I issued a proclamation. I couldn't pardon them posthumously, but I issued a proclamation essentially saying that a terrible injustice had been done, and that we should remember that, not just because it involved two Italian immigrants, so that was very important. And obviously my background and the fact that my parents had come over to this country and I had been brought up here had a lot to do with that. But it seemed to me it was a particularly good time to point out that that when things happen that are unjust, and this was a very unjust episode in the history of Massachusetts and of the country for that matter, because the case, as I think many of you know, had great national interest. The least I could do as governor was to say that and to issue a proclamation saying emphatically that a terrible injustice had been done and that we should recognize that even years after those executions took place. It wasn't applauded universally. I can tell you there were people still around who did not understand just how unjust that whole situation was. But I thought it was important for at least one governor of Massachusetts to say that and do that. And so I was that governor. And I'm very proud of what we did in the 1970s, and at least recognize the injustice that was done to these two men. I don't have to tell you that they were clearly folks that had to face anti-Italian prejudice during the 1920s. It was Southern Europeans, and that meant Italians as well as Greeks and Portuguese and so forth. It was Southern European, and especially the Italian community, that was the subject of great prejudice. We don't recognize that today. The Italian community, needless to say, has gone on to do great things in this country and continues to do so. But at that time, the 1920s, it was the Italians, and to a lesser extent, the rest of us from Southern Europe, that were the subject of very serious prejudice and bias. So at least in doing that and recognizing it, it seemed to me it was important for Massachusetts to stand up and say what really had happened. And I'm very proud of the fact to this day that I was in a position to do that. In the course of this, obviously, I had a chance to meet Bob, work with him, an extraordinary guy, just passionate about what he believed, and completely dedicated to the cause of recognizing the terrible injustice that was done to those two men, and to the bias and prejudice that went along with it. So it's a pleasure to be here with you today, and to recognize Bob's role, and it was a great one, in making sure people understood just what had happened and why. And I considered him a friend, and will always consider him a friend, and proud to be able to be here and recognize the enormous amount of work that he did to make sure people understood what had happened in that case and why, and to try to make sure that it never happened again. So it's a pleasure to be with you, and pleasure to be able to make these few remarks and recognize not only what happened back in the 1920s, but the incredible work that Bob did in making sure that people never forgot that case and what it stood for. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Governor Dukakis. Next is going to be Judge Peter Agnes, Massachusetts Appeal Court Associate Justice. Peter Agnes Jr. began his judicial career as a first justice of the Charlestown District Court in 1991. Served as a chief of operations for Governor Michael Dukakis, and has been very active as an educator, presenter, and archivist, closely associated with Bob Datilio on the Sacco and Vanzetti case. Judge Peter Agnes, go ahead, please.
It's a pleasure to be with all of you today to celebrate the life of our friend, Bob Datilio. I served as a judge in Massachusetts for nearly 30 years, retiring last year, but I've known Bob for even longer. And I believe I met Bob in the early 1980s or the mid-1980s while attending an event at the Dante Alighieri Society in Cambridge. And I don't recall how we got around to discussing the Sacco Vanzetti case, but all of you who knew Bob know if you have a conversation with him, you will get around to discussing the Sacco Vanzetti case. So it turned out we had a lot in common. Bob obviously was mindful of and very much interested in the proclamation that Governor Dukakis issued in 1977. And I, of course, worked for the governor during the 1980s. And also, Governor Dukakis mentioned Al Cella as someone who interested him in the case and who was advocating on behalf of Sacco and Vanzetti. And I had the good fortune to have Al Cella as a law professor during law school. So the Sacco Vanzetti case is like the sun, which holds the planet in its orbit. It draws people together, and they never leave. So as I got to know Bob, we set out to do a number of things together, and those included a vision that we had in the early 1990s for a project that would make archives of the Sacco Vanzetti case, which were at the Boston Public Library and at the Supreme Judicial Court archives, available to everyone. Bob, as many of you know, but perhaps not all of you know, was one of the people who was instrumental in bringing the Felicani collection of Sacco Vanzetti Defense Committee material to the Boston Public Library. That was one of Bob's great contributions to the scholarship of this case. He did that in 1979, and there was a major symposium at the Boston Public Library that year. Bob spoke at that symposium, and Bob's talk was admired by all the scholars who were there because Bob made the fundamental point, which opened up a whole new chapter in the study of Sacco and Vanzetti, the fundamental point that you cannot understand these men and the case by just looking at documents about the legal proceedings. You had to understand the anarchist background of the two men. And much of that was contained in the Felicani collection, which Bob brought to the library. So the vision that we had after that collection was deposited was making it available. And we actually had conversations with people from the state archives in the early 1990s about doing it. And unfortunately, the technology at the time was so expensive, it wasn't practical. But I really am saddened by Bob's death because this year, I know Bob was looking forward to this year because finally, after much work, the Felicani collection at the Boston Public Library is now available online in a digital form, and the entire collection of legal papers held by the Supreme Judicial Court also just came online thanks to the efforts of Digital Commonwealth. So Bob would have been delighted to know that a whole new generation of scholars and public-minded people could have access to material that never before would have been available to them without painstaking research conducted here in Massachusetts. And this will mean that new insights will be gained into the case as a result of Bob's efforts. As we heard earlier, Bob was a perfectionist. And I think that was one of the reasons why Bob did not publish more about the case himself, because he always knew there was another stone to be unturned, another interview to be conducted, more research to be done, and he just never got around to finishing it. But he was, in addition to being a fine scholar, although he did not hold a teaching position and did not have a doctorate degree, he was a kind and gentle man who never was too busy to talk about the Sacco Vanzetti case. And so we spent many, many hours together. And Bob also, I should say, was a contributor to the very important decision that was made in 1997 for the Gutsan Borglum bas relief that you saw earlier, that a copy of which is at the community church and the plaster model of which is at the Boston Public Library. Bob helped put together the effort that resulted in Mayor Tom Menino of Boston and then Governor Archio Paul Cellucci, the governor of the Commonwealth, to accept, after decades and decades of governors and mayors turning it down, to accept Gutsan Borglum's magnificent piece of work, which is now available for people to see at the Boston Public Library, or as soon as we get back to going to the library. So Bob was a genuine intellectual, a passionate advocate for the cause of Sacco and Vanzetti, a man who brought many other people into the orbit of the Sacco Vanzetti case who have made their own scholarly contributions, and a friend who I will miss dearly.
Thank you very much, Judge Agnes. Next, we are going to have the pleasure of listening a musical performance by great musician Charlie King. Charlie was actually nominated by Peter Seeger in 1999 to receive the Sacco and Vanzetti Social Justice Award, which he, of course, received. Now, the musical work of Charlie has continued, thank goodness for all of us, up to this day. And here is Charlie King.
Thank you, Sergio. I'm going to sing a song that I wrote for the 50th anniversary of the execution of Nicola Sacco and Bartolomeo Vanzetti. And it was first sung on the streets of Boston the night of that anniversary. And the chorus is based on the words that Vanzetti spoke to Judge Webster Thayer when he was sentenced to death. And the song is called Two Good Arms. And I'm happy to say that every year when Community Church presents the Sacco and Vanzetti Award, this song is sung by somebody. Who will remember the hand so white and fine that touched the finest linen and poured the finest wine? Who will remember the genteel words they spoke to name the lives of two good men a nuisance or a joke? All who know these two good arms know I never had to rob or kill. I have lived by my own two hands and lived well. And all my life I have struggled to rid the earth of all such crime. Who will remember Judge Webster Thayer, one hand on the gavel, the other resting on the chair? Who will remember the hateful words he said, speaking to the living in the language of the dead? All who know these two good arms know I never had to rob or kill. I can live by my own two hands and live well. And all my life I have struggled to rid the earth of all such crime. Who will remember the hand upon the switch that took the lives of two good men in the service of the rich? Who will remember the one that gave the nod, or the chaplain standing near at hand to invoke the name of God? We will remember this good shoemaker. We will remember this poor fish peddler. We will remember all the strong arms and hands that never once found justice in the hands that rule this land. And all who know these two good men know they never had to rob or kill. Each had lived by his own two hands, and they lived well. And all their lives they had struggled to rid the earth of all such crime. And all our lives we must struggle to rid the earth of all such crime.
Great. Thank you so much. In our real world, we would hear a whole round of applause, my friend. But here we are. Okay, thank you so much. What we have now is a message sent to us by Luigi Botta from Italy. Luigi is an Italian artist, a writer, a historian, and researcher of the Italian anarchist presence in the United States. He currently lives in Turin, Italy. His first book was printed in 1978 under the title Sacco Vanzetti Giustiziati la Verità, Execute Truth. Since then, he has written extensively on the case. He has almost completed a study on Bartolomeo Vanzetti's family correspondence, bringing the number of letters that will be published and commented onto almost 200, of which almost half have been unpublished. Bob was his foremost historical resource in Boston. So, Michele, if you are ready, go ahead and run Luigi's message, please.
Il ricordo che ho di Bob Dattiglio si perde nella memoria, nell'amicizia e nella mia frequentazione per lunghi lustri a partire dagli inizi degli anni 70 con Vincenzina, la sorella di Bartolomeo Vanzetti, una donna umile ma fantastica, semplice ma illuminata, mansueta ma battagliera. La pubblicazione del mio primo libro sul caso di Nick e Bart, che nel 1978 si avvale della prefazione di Pietro Nenni, presidente del Comitato Internazionale Sacco e Vanzetti, non chiude un capitolo, ma bensì apre una porta verso una passione coinvolgente, destinata a durare nel tempo e a guardare oltre con determinazione verso obiettivi ed orizzonti prima d'allora scarsamente approfonditi. Non ho mai personalmente incontrato Bob, ma è proprio Vincenzina a richiamarlo costantemente nei suoi discorsi, affidando al medesimo un compito, quello di far definitiva luce sul caso, per noi tutti, allora neofiti della storia sovversiva dei due emigrati italiani, di fatto irraggiungibile. La conoscenza diretta con lui si fa concreta con la nascita della Sacco and Vanzetti Commemoration Society. Senza preamboli, come vecchi amici, la conversazione e il confronto diventano fin da subito un'affannosa e quasi ossessiva ricerca della verità. Pur dialogando alla pari, mi sento discente di fronte alle parole di un maestro. Le epistole che viaggiano nel web tra Medford e il mio computer si fanno costanti e quotidiane. Ogni giorno è attesa una risposta, ogni giorno una domanda indugia nella speranza di un immediato chiarimento. Tassello si aggiunge a tassello e le tessere mancanti del grande mosaico del dramma di Sacco e Vanzetti trovano poco alla volta la loro destinazione. Finalmente posso permettermi di interrogare chi sa tutto su Nick e Bart, porre fine alle mie incertezze nella consapevolezza di poter sicuramente ottenere risposte rassicuranti. Bob non è mai banale, non si mostra ovvio e prevedibile. Il suo discorso è fatto di tante citazioni, ma anche di memorie visive legate alla sua pluridecennale esperienza. Racconta, cita, spiega, sovente si spinge in una narrazione che va oltre la richiesta. Di tanto in tanto pone pure lui domande e si attende le risposte. Sovente lascia cadere gli argomenti, li riprende in tempi successivi. Non sfugge mai ai miei interrogativi. Non ama le sentenze e evita con ferrea determinazione ogni genere di lezione. Anzi, molte volte si mostra confidente e si lascia trascinare in discorsi che esulano dal contesto epistolare. E comunque, sempre amareggiato, anche dopo pagine di scrittura, per quanto avrebbe voluto raccontare, ma non è riuscito. L'amarezza è sua, personale, emozionale, non certo politica e sociale, legata ai suoi malanni dell'età, alla sua solitudine, ai suoi impegni con la famiglia, ai suoi amici che se ne vanno e alla consapevole tristezza che caratterizza chi vive negli anni della maturità senza un'opportuna compagnia. Umana, insomma. Bob ama, quando è il caso, anche ironizzare. Lo fa collegando la mia narrazione alla memoria del suo trascorso da italiano emigrato in Nord America. Quando si esalta nel leggere delle tradizioni nostrane, anche culinarie, o quando sottolinea, pensando che anch'io lo faccia, che a fianco della sua tastiera del computer, vero o falso non lo saprò mai, c'è un bicchiere di grappa che appartiene al suo paese d'origine. Diventa confidenziale quando narra della sua trascorsa vicinanza a Raffaele Schiavina, quando si cruccia per il comportamento di Norman Di Giovanni, quando sostiene che Nicola e Bartolomeo mai e poi mai possono essere definiti un buon calzolaio e un povero pescivendolo, perché la frase attribuita al piemontese rappresenta un falso storico. Quando quasi sussurra che il galleanismo non è mai esistito, è pura fantasia, frutto di ricostruzioni postume che guardano col paraocchi ad una fase storica molto diversificata, tenute insieme da un collante ideologico che ha fatto convivere le esperienze più diverse. Bob si esalta nel segnalare che il Vermont ha sostenuto le spese per la digitalizzazione della cronaca sovversiva. Vedrai, mi scrive, qual è il piacere della lettura e aggiunge: si tratta di un giornale dove troverai di tutto, che sulle sue pagine ha affrontato i più svariati argomenti, dai più drammatici e ideologici ai più fascinosi e confidenziali. Racconta dei suoi crucci, del progetto che non è andato in porto, ma che è sicuro di riuscire ancora a realizzare con l'aiuto di tutti e forse immaginandosi eterno. Quello di pubblicare in internet le lettere di Nicola e di Bartolomeo. Si arrabbia quando ricorda gli errori nel film del regista Giuliano Montaldo, perché non ha seguito le sue indicazioni. Se la prende con Paul Avrich e anche con Francis Russell quando abbandonano la verità storica per lasciarsi trascinare in narrazioni che sono frutto della loro fantasia o della fantasia dei loro interlocutori non attendibili. Si inalbera, lui che ha letto meticolosamente tutta la pratica del BOI e dell'FBI che riguarda l'argomento, quando il nome di Mario Buda viene associato all'attentato di Wall Street del 1920. La narrazione su Bob potrebbe andare oltre. Nella vicenda di Sacco e Vanzetti ha lasciato il segno. Purtroppo, per eccesso di zelo e di perfezione, non è riuscito a pubblicare sulla storia dei due italiani quel libro che era nelle sue speranze di giovane studioso degli anni 60. Il suo archivio documenterà comunque il lavoro fatto, rendendolo disponibile, così si spera, per chi darà seguito alle sue ricerche. Personalmente dovrò purtroppo rinunciare a conoscere la risposta a molte altre mie domande e prima o poi dovrò decidermi a ordinare i nostri lunghi dialoghi per trasformarli da semplici chiacchierate quali sono state in utili e durature testimonianze.
Next, we are going to hear from Joseph Torra. Joe Torra is a poet, a novelist, a memoirist, and an editor. He is a Boston native, currently teaching at UMass Boston, and was a close friend of Bob Datilio. Joe, go ahead.
Hey, thanks, Sergio. And it's really great to be here with you all, and it's an honor. And I want to thank everyone who made it possible. There were a lot of people behind the scenes who did extraordinary work, Sergio, Dean, and others. And I want to especially shout out to Michele Fazio, who I don't know where we would have been without her. She was just the go-to person, and she's probably one of the busiest people I know. So thank you, Michele. Yeah, I knew Bob all through the literary community. Bob traveled in a lot of circles, as we'll probably hear as this event goes on. He was not all things Sacco and Vanzetti. He was many things. And I first met Bob about 30 years ago, maybe a little more, when a group of poets and writers I knew, we were reading Dante's Divine Comedy aloud once a week on Monday nights in the original Italian. And Bob showed up with a poet, and he was marvelous. He was probably the best reader, and we connected immediately over many things. I had albums back then, and Bob loved jazz, and we started talking about jazz, and in no time we just became fast friends. And Bob was known in the local literary community. He would go to poetry readings, various literary events in town, and so a lot of people in that community knew Bob as well. He was very well read. He loved literature, loved poetry. So that was just one little thing. And as we went on, Bob became a very close friend to me, my family, my children, and he also became a very big force in my life as a mentor and a teacher. He turned me on to things I never knew about my literary heritage, my Italian American heritage. And I learned so much about the activist, radical end of the time of the Italian American experience back at the turn of the century, especially, but much more than that. I ended up writing a historical novel focusing on a lot of that material called The Bystander Scrapbook, which there has a main character based on Bob. Anyone who knew Bob as a writer, you never turn away a great character when it's handed to you on a silver platter. And I dedicated that novel to Bob too. So he had a huge impact on my life. We remained friends. Last time I saw him was just a couple of weeks before his passing over an espresso at this little local Italian cafe in Medford, where we'd been going for many, many years together. So that's all I really want to say, because otherwise I'd just talk too much. He was everything that's being said here is wonderful. He was ornery. He was brilliant. He was always a delight. He always would say something about Sacco and Vanzetti, even if you were talking about how to make a good spaghetti sauce. So that was Bob, and I miss him terribly. I miss him every day, and I think about him. And it's great to see how many of you people from all over were affected by Bob, and he was really something else. Thank you all.
Great, thank you, Joe. And now that was a great introduction to what we are about to see and hear, because we are going to hear Bob himself speaking about anarchy in the United States. And Michele is ready to run that video, which was produced by David Rothauser.
My name is Bob Datilio. I'm a historian who has been researching the Sacco Vanzetti case for over 25 years right now. The anarchist group that was gathered around the figure of Luigi Galliani was perceived by the U.S. government to be a threat. This began about 1915 with the beginnings of World War I. Earlier, anarchists had been seen as a threat to the U.S. government. This was after the assassination of McKinley by Scholgoltz, an anarchist who was living in America who shot President McKinley. After McKinley's assassination, for the first time, a political designation, that of anarchist, became part of federal law. It was grounds for arrest or deportation. This was the first time that a political designation was used as such in American history. This aspect of the law, however, was not really used in the following years as soon as the anarchist scare surrounding the assassination stopped. However, Galliani by that time had come to America in 1903, just shortly after this scare. And he was involved in many labor issues, but he began a newspaper, Cronica Sovversiva, which became well known to the authorities, but mostly state authorities. It wasn't until the outbreak of World War I that the laws against anarchism started to be enforced again. Italy, of course, which is where Sacco and Vanzetti and Galliani came from, had entered World War I on the side of the Allies. And there was a drive among Italian citizens to bring the immigrants back from overseas to fight for Italy. Galliani, Sacco, and Vanzetti were in the forefront of the fight not to send back young immigrants to fight for the King of Italy. This brought some attention upon the group through the Italian consular services, who mentioned this to the American government. But soon, when the American government itself started moving toward war, and when it did enter war in 1916, 1917, we had many of the laws that came into being for the first time, which still exist, or in today's America are quite familiar with us, the alien and sedition laws, and also laws that were very strong against any kind of printed, published material that was critical of the war effort. To criticize the war was considered a crime by many of the federal officers throughout the country. Galliani's group was at the center of this because they were both against the war when Italy was involved, and certainly against the against the war when the United States entered into it. As a matter of fact, in 1917, there were a group of anarchists that left the United States for Mexico, including Sacco and Vanzetti. Later, this would be part of their trial, that they had gone to evade the draft for the United States. Actually, they had not gone to evade the draft. Their thinking was much more sophisticated. They went to Mexico because they wanted to return to Italy to make the revolution. Their thinking was that the war would bring about, whatever way it was resolved, would bring about a revolutionary situation in Italy that they wanted to be part of. As I looked at the group that Sacco and Vanzetti were part of, they were essentially self-taught. I mean, most of them became anarchists because of the American experience. Very few of them. There were, of course, some significant figures who were anarchists when they did come to the United States. But the great part of the Italian-American anarchist movement became anarchists in the United States. But for me, it's a way to get a hold of two cultures, both of which, of course, I'm intimately involved in. But I think this is a story of any immigrant when he comes to a new country and how the two countries relate to each other, the two cultures. The group that Sacco and Vanzetti began with they were a political group. They weren't just interested, they weren't just a social group that was interested in having a good time, even in helping one another. They wanted to remake society. And in a way, in a little bit of a way, the motives for that are a bit of a mystery, which I think perhaps all deep motives are. What really made Sacco and Vanzetti thirst so much for social justice is immigrants who just wanted maybe some adventure, a better way of life, all of a sudden get driven to this thirst for social justice, to make a revolution, to make a better world, and sustain it for such a long period of time. Ultimately, for me, it's rather a mystery, a rather beautiful mystery, but one I couldn't pretend to take any clear lesson from, but one that I still find worthy of contemplation. I find it all very operatic, and for me, opera is the great achievement of humankind.
For the material, thank you to David Rothauser for making possible that we have that testimony from Bob. We are now going to hear from Jake, which I'm going to ask to reactivate his audio. And Jake Carman is a founding member of the Sacco and Vanzetti Commemoration Society, the Black Rose Anarchist Federation, and founder and coordinator of the urban communal agriculture movement, the Cambridge City Growers. He is also a musician and the author of the book 9 Years of Anarchist Agitation, History of the Boston Anti-Authoritarian Movement. Jake is also a full-time father of two and works as a handyman. Jake, take it on.
Thank you, Sergio. Thank you, everybody, for being here and everybody who's spoken so far. Really appreciate the opportunity to be able to participate in remembering Bob. So I became involved in the world through which I met Bob back in 2003. I was a 17-year-old. The war in Iraq was just breaking out. And very soon I was involved in protests and I joined my first anarchist group. And at the time, my family and people around me told me that I was young and it was a phase. I was a young anarchist. I would grow out of it. I thought that they were underestimating my stubbornness. And then I met Bob. I saw Bob for the first time. I can't remember if it was at an anarchist book fair at Mass Art or at the Community Church of Boston at a summit of political groups. He certainly spoke at both, but he was definitely speaking about Sacco and Vanzetti. And Sacco and Vanzetti was a topic that was important to me. Growing up in Massachusetts, it was learning about Sacco and Vanzetti in middle school history class that first made me interested in anarchism and made me realize that it wasn't just like a punk rock ideal, just what Nirvana was into, but it was actually a political movement with an alternative vision for how the world could and should operate. And I began researching it and realized how beautiful that vision was and how deep and how to the root of our issues it is able to cut. So years later, actually not very many years later, only a few years later, I approached Bob about beginning to hold commemoration events in August that were in the forms of protests to remember Sacco and Vanzetti and to tie Sacco and Vanzetti's struggles and memories with current issues, current people being oppressed and fighting back against oppression. We held an event together with Sergio and some others on this call here at Jamaica Plain, and we marched to the cemetery where they were cremated. That was kind of the impetus for the Sacco and Vanzetti Commemoration Society, which we made official the following year. And we've held events together every year in August to remember Sacco and Vanzetti and to highlight others fighting against oppression and fighting for freedom. Bob and I didn't always agree. We're both anarchists, but we come from different anarchist traditions. For me, anarchism is about organization building, institution building, and building long-term structures that reflect the world that we want. For Bob, as you just saw, it's all about opera. It's very, artistic. There's a lot of free will and individualism. And we had some disagreements and ups and downs, but it was always clear that Bob was so passionate and dedicated to Sacco and Vanzetti, and you could really tell by his knowledge. He was just such a wealth of knowledge. He's also always the stage manager. So a lot of the issues we've had today wouldn't have happened if Bob was here, because he would have made us rehearse them again and again and show up 2 or 3 hours early, make sure the microphones work, and all these things that we will miss Bob for. Always 3 hours early. And I'll remember these things, his face and his voice. I'll always be able to remember those when I close my eyes. And he'll always be telling me nobody's perfect every time I think of him. Usually he was talking about me, but I think it's just a good thing to remember. Recently, a photo negative surfaced that purported to show the actual execution of Sacco and Vanzetti. When this photo came up, I really wish that Bob was here to show to and to hear what his thoughts on it were. It was either actually a photo taken with really old technology, or a drawing perhaps of a photo, or from somebody who was there, or somebody who researched it very in depth, because they even had the correct executioner. And it was a really haunting photo, or image I should say, of Vanzetti sitting in the electric chair, Sacco being carted away in a cart. And frankly, it was hard to look at, to see my comrades in their last moments like that. And the thing that really stuck out to me about this image is that above the chair on the wall in big black letters is the word silence. This made me think perhaps this was just propaganda, but the more I thought about it, I realized that directly facing this chair would have been a viewing audience, and that the word silence may have been to ensure that the people in the room were quiet and didn't make any noise while the men's lives were being ended. And this made me think about Sacco and Vanzetti dying in silence, which reminded me of what we know about Bob's passing, being alone in his house. But then again, when it comes to Sacco and Vanzetti, there is no silence. We're still talking, we're still chanting and singing, acting and reenacting and writing. And Bob had a lot to do with the insurance, the insistence that we would not be silent, that Sacco and Vanzetti's memory would not be silenced. Bob's voice and his work will be forever intertwined in this story, because he's done so much. And you could see that today by all the slides and the stories that people brought up. But Bob also lives on in so many other stories, in his own stories, and the moments that we shared with him, the ways that we'll remember him, and each of these we will carry ourselves. And in this way, Bob the Tilio will live on. So in closing, I just like to say, remember Bob the Tilio. Thank you.
Thank you, Jake. Now we are going to hear from Pasqualino Colombaro. Pasqualino was born in L'Aquila, Abruzzi, Italia, actually 19 miles from Bob's ancestral town of Navelli.
Kilometers.
And grew up in Pescara, Abruzzi, Italy, prior to emigrating to Boston. Before retiring in 2010, Pasqualino was a labor and community activist in Massachusetts for close to 40 years. Yeah, he's an old man. He worked as a representative for the Service Employees International Union. He was also a founding member of that important organization, Jobs with Justice, and the Italian American Labor Council, work in Massachusetts, and the Center for International Social Studies in Rome. He currently lives and has joined us from Spain. Pasqualino Colombaro, adelante.
Gracias, Sergio. Thank you very much for inviting me to speak, and I'm very happy to be here with another 60 people at this time. All friends of Bob Dattilo, commemorating his life and his friendship. Bob and I shared, well, as you said, a deep ethnic root tracing back to an Italian town called L'Aquila, where I was born. Navelli, the village where his folks were from, is at 19 kilometers east of L'Aquila in the Abruzzi region of Italy. But it wasn't for that reason that Bob always treated me with bemused respect, never expressing the least tone of intolerance towards the controversial things I often said in public in our ongoing conversations about the sorry state of affairs of our social reality. This, despite the fact that on my part, I would not miss an opportunity to criticize certain of his provocative affirmations regarding the state of affairs in the US and what to do about it. From his parents and from the tradition of Cronaca Sovversiva and the Adunata dei Refrattari, he had inherited a certain je ne sais quoi non-attached way to be in the world and to witness its phenomena, which was at once calm, amused, and invested in upholding the inherent human right to act and express oneself as one saw fit. In conversations about his capillary knowledge of the family and friends constellations of Sacco, Vanzetti, Felicani, or Schiavina, he would address me as if I also was a member in the know of the tribe. Of course, I knew nothing and nobody about any of them. My first memory of him was in a bar in the North End in 1975, 45 years ago, where he asked me about my graduate studies in sociology at Boston University. And I remember explaining to him in a very serious and somber tone how I was concentrating on Marxist sociological theory and how I thought that some of the analytical and critical tools Marx used in looking at the world were very helpful in arriving at fundamental truths about capitalist society. He burst out laughing and said he couldn't believe that there were still serious Marxists out there. For several years after that, he'd call me the Marxist every time he saw me or had to qualify my more critical and combative stances towards his quips. He liked to joke that way in a self-congratulatory manner. He eventually moved with age from Marxist to caro, dear one. Bob was already 38 when I arrived in Boston in 1974, but he already suffered from a long-term grief reaction for the ravages brought about by urban renewal in the 1950s, which included the destruction of Scully Square, of the entire ethnic neighborhood of the West End, made up of working-class Jewish and Italian families, and the construction of a major highway, I-95, that split the city in half. It would always recall as a paradise lost the way East Boston was prior to the airport expansion, the North End prior to I-95, the Lebanese South End prior to gentrification. More recently, he was not only heartbroken at the ugly, extravagant, luxurious aesthetics of the renewed city that the renewed city had acquired, but disgusted at the orgy of money and cement that it represented. A grief that was supplanted only by that for the premature death of his wife, Carolina, in 2009. I can't count the nights we spent together at restaurants like the European or the Café dello Sport in the North End, in the company of friends like Ralph Fasanella when he was painting the Lawrence strike. I was very active organizing on the labor side of things, and so was he on the historical aesthetic side within the Italian-American community and outside. I can't mention the numberless emails, meetings, conferences, events we organized and attended together over the years. Needless to say, when I got the news of his passing, it hit me unexpectedly hard. He will be missed sorely, even though he wasn't perfect either. Punctilious investigator and researcher, artist, historian, and rebel. Through him, I first heard of Naomi Klein, Fractals, Black Swans, Gaia, the Mondragon Cooperative, the Archivio Pinelli, Osvaldo Bayer, and Severino Di Giovanni. Also through him, I realized how much of my commitment to workers' emancipation, originally matured in Italy, came from the same source as the main body of his historical studies, the Italian anarchist experience in the Americas and in Europe. I realized that as a labor and community activist in Boston, I was stepping on the tiles literally laid down by those intrepid individuals up to the death of Sacco and Vanzetti and beyond. A good traveler has no fixed plans. A good artist lets his intuition lead him wherever it wants. A good scientist has freed himself of concepts and keeps his mind open to what is. Thus, the master is available to all people and doesn't reject anyone. What is a good man but a bad man's teacher? What is a bad man but a good man's job? If you don't understand this, you will get lost, however intelligent you are. It is the great secret. Tao Te Ching 27, the Stephen Mitchell translation of 1988. Thank you.
Thank you so much, my friend Pasqualino Colombaro. We are going to actually hear now from another good friend of Bob, Zoffreo. Let me see, I'm going to ask him. CEO and co-founder of Flysoft, the world foremost developer of PC-based flight simulation products for airlines and consumer retail markets since 1993. Pat holds an MBA, Master's in Business Administration from Boston College in '93 and studied at the New England Conservatory of Music and received a BA from Boston University in 1977, where he majored in comparative religious studies, liberal arts, and violin performance. And that's the performance actually that you heard at the beginning, accompanying some of the Bob's images.
In Michael Parenti's book, Waiting for Yesterday, there is an encounter between an old man that was sweeping the steps of a church and a young college-age student who was visiting Italy for the very first time. In this exchange, the old man asks the question, "Are you Italian?" While the young man answered, "No, I'm American," the old man waved that answer aside, still smiling, and responded, "Ma I tuoi genitori sono italiani," translated, "But your parents are Italian." This was not a question, it was a statement from which the young man responded, "But how did you know?" Earlier in the book, there is a subsection of the chapter entitled Inventing Space. And in our reflection today, it was the neighborhood space that Italian Americans had invented that was so formative in Bob's concept of neighborhood. Bob was an inventor of people spaces, a state of mind that seeks to bring people together from different backgrounds or different walks of life to address a common concern. And in Bob's case, a lifelong passion for social justice. As we can see today, the diversity of speakers and participants at this memorial service, all of whom come from different political, economic, social backgrounds, and in fact, from all over the world. All of them drawn to this event today because of the character single-minded determination and passion Bob DiTilio demonstrated in his pursuit of social justice. The concept of neighborhood space has been well described by Italian-American scholar Jerome Crossi in his paper, Italian and Italian-American Spaces. In this paper, Crossi writes, when we pass through urban spaces such as a residential neighborhood we haven't visited before, we are like tourists, using our eyes to decipher the clues and cues that loudly and quietly surround us. In his work on Italian-American society, Crossi utilizes theories, methods, and ideas that emphasize the visual. He believes that society is essentially dependent on the visible. In Italian-American neighborhoods, it is the visual and visible that provides the visitor with an exciting field trip to a visually intoxicating anthropological garden. South Medford, where Bob called home, is one such neighborhood space. The Italian-American neighborhood space, or as sociologists like to refer it to, the anthropological garden, is filled with the wonders of the past. Be it homes with statuary figures of Roman Catholic saints that adorn the front yards, to vegetable gardens in the backyards during summer months. If you visit these neighborhoods during the early parts of October, you'll find wooden crates lining sidewalk streets in front of homes awaiting trash collection. These wooden crates, however, contained the Barbera, Zinfandel, and Moscato grape varietals that were purchased to make wine. Many Italian immigrants maintain the tradition of making wine on Columbus Day holiday weekend. In our childhoods, our neighbors would sample the wine made by our fathers. The elderly gentlemen of the neighborhood would come to our father's wine cellars with notebooks and pencils in hand and take meticulous notes on a wine's bouquet, and our fathers would do the same when visiting a neighbor's wine cellar. These elderly gentlemen would come to see our vegetable garden during the summer months, and our parents would visit theirs to inspect their gardens. Discerning elders would point out the characteristic features of big boy versus beefsteak tomatoes or plum tomatoes, eggplant, cucumbers, broccoli rabe, or maybe salad greens. Did the Della Piccolos make a better wine this year, or did the Borellis have the best vegetable garden this summer? And whose fig tree had the largest and juiciest figs? I remember stories of Italian families coming out of church on Sunday mornings and visiting the bakery across the street, and in the back room, stretched out on a bread-making table, was the baker, exhausted from the prior evening and morning's exercise of baking bread. He was fast asleep on the table. The families would enter the bakery after church, take whatever bread they needed, and leave the money owed the baker in the large jars at the front counter without disturbing the baker from a well-deserved sleep. This was the neighborhood space that informed a very young Bob DiTilio, a place very visible, very visual, and in very tangible ways. This anthropological garden was so well described by spatial sociologists, but that neighborhood space has all but disappeared from most cities and towns throughout America. But there are remnants of it still present in some manner in South Medford, where Bob had lived in the same family home for much of his life. The elders that made this space, this neighborhood space, so fascinating were artisans in the real sense of the word. the discernment they demonstrated in their meticulous care of a vegetable garden, or their insights into a wine's enduring characteristics, their craftsmanship in carpentry, construction, ironworks, bricklaying, and other areas was an important aspect in the formation of a young child who grew up in these neighborhoods. Social clubs were frequented by young children who helped their father wash the floors or shovel the snow in wintertime or polish the furniture, cut the grass outside the building during warmer months. These social clubs, however, were much more than the name implies. They were an important part of the safety net of the neighborhood, a place where funds were collected and placed in a trust to fund a family whose father suddenly died or had been hospitalized because of a job-related injury. Funds were collected and set aside perhaps to pay for an operation or a hospital stay. The social club was neighborhood space where a young boy or girl learned about the practical side of social justice, of caring for one another and those less fortunate than themselves. It is in this neighborhood space that Robert DiTilio learned discernment and a passion for social justice. Do you remember how we started this brief talk? Do you remember the old man sweeping the steps of the church from dirt and debris? Bob DiTilio is that old man sweeping the dirt from the steps of our society. Bob taught us the importance of social justice, the virtues of persistence and single-mindedness of purpose, character traits we all admired about him, along with his remarkable gift of humor in the midst of insurmountable odds. Bob's broom was his typewriter, and later on the Mac computer. And his upbringing taught him discernment and a passion for social justice. Bob also understood what the elders of our community taught us, that the Italian-American neighborhood is first and foremost a state of mind. These are the lessons Bob DiTilio offers us and the next generation. Whenever we remember Bob, we will always remember him as that dignified elderly gentleman sweeping the steps of society's injustices and inappropriate behavior in our thoughts, in our hearts, and in our minds. And what a wonderful tribute and way to remember someone, that he was a very, very strong advocate for social justice. It was a great privilege knowing him and calling him a dear friend. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you, Pat.
You're welcome, Sergio.
We are going to see and hear a piece prepared especially by Leonard Lerman.
Helene was really kind of the midwife with me to the Mark Blitzstein opera, Sacco and Vanzetti, which he worked on most of his life, and which Bob helped me do research for at the Boston Public Library. He also participated in a symposium on the Blitzstein opera for the National Opera Association in Boston with Howard Zinn and others on December 1st, 1995. There's a transcript of that which is online, and I put the link to it in the chat. You can see what Bob said at that in that transcript. Bob also connected us with Sacco's niece, Fernanda, who invited us to Torre Maggiore, where we gave a concert, and this plaque was actually made for us while we were there, while I was working on the opera. The opera wasn't completed until 2001. This was from the year 2000. And I have to say that I knew Bob DiTilio actually through Community Church of Boston. I knew Community Church through Sue Koritz, who was a friend of my parents from before I was born in the 1940s and invited us to do a work that I wrote on the Rosenbergs called "We Are Innocent," and this had a dozen performances, including one at Community Church in 1988. And I'm pretty sure that's when I first met Bob DiTilio and started thinking about completing this Sacco and Vanzetti in earnest. I had heard about the Blitzstein opera when I was working on his other pieces that Leonard Bernstein advised me on and helped me work complete. So we're going to hear two excerpts now. The opera was premiered at the at the White Barn Theater in Westport, Connecticut. Bob was there in August of 2001. It was just before 9/11, and then after that, it became an uphill battle that we're still fighting to get an opera company interested in anarchists as heroes and law enforcement as villains. But the Hofstra Italian Festival scheduled it for the New York premiere this past September, which of course has been postponed. And we're working on other possibilities. There's a very, very good possibility that has been tentatively scheduled in February of 2022 at UCLA, where Michael Dukakis is on the faculty, because he's a character in my completion of Blitzstein's work. I got a lot of flack for that because Blitzstein didn't live long enough to experience the exoneration in 1977, but his state did, and they approved of it. And Michael Dukakis is a character in the opera. Helena's going to screen share two very short excerpts. The one is Vanzetti's famous last statement, "If it had not been for these things," and the music under that is then used at the end of the opera to underscore Michael Dukakis' exoneration speech, which was spoken by Maurice Edwards, a great actor who just died at the age of 97. And in fact, the New York Times obituary of him mentioned this role that he did. So,
my friend, you believe we will die. Don't take it too hard. If it had not been for this thing, I might have lived out my life talking at street corners to scorning men. I might have died unmarked, unknown, a failure. Now we are not a failure. This is our career and our triumph. Never in our full life can we hope to do such work for tolerance, for justice, for man's understanding of man, as now we do by an accident. Our words, our lives, our pains, nothing but taking of our lives. Oh, that last moment belongs to us. That last moment belongs to us. That agony is our triumph.
July 19, 1977. The trial and execution of Sacco and Vanzetti should serve to remind all civilized people of the constant need to guard against susceptibility to prejudice, intolerance of unorthodox ideas, and failure to defend the rights of strangers in our midst. Any stigma and disgrace should be forever removed from the names of Nicola Sacco and Pasqualino Vanzetti. I hereby call upon the people of Massachusetts to reflect upon these tragic events and draw from their historic lessons the resolve to prevent their reoccurrence.
Thank you so much, Leonard, and thank you, Helen, for the technical assistance there. Next, we are going to hear from somebody who has been central to the production of this memorial, this remembrance of Bob Datilio, Miss Michele Fazio. Michele is a professor of English at the University of North Carolina at Pembroke. Her research on family history and labor radicalism has been exhibited at the Harvard Law School Library and the American Labor Museum. She is currently working on a book project exploring the cultural legacy of Sacco and Vanzetti. Michele, go ahead, please.
Thank you, Sergio. And thank you to everyone. This has been such a wonderful program to hear from all of you. I've heard Bob talk about your names, but I never knew who you were. So I got to, I'm getting to know you and to see your faces. It's been such a rich program. So by the time I had met Bob a few years ago, he had mellowed considerably with age, not politically, of course, but physically. He was without a doubt one of the quirkiest people I've ever met. Bob would call me all hours of the day and night during the week and the weekends, inquiring if I've read this essay or heard about this scholar. Of course he had, and in that vein, Bob's phone calls were more like a cross-examination. With his signature combination of wit and sarcasm, he continuously tested my knowledge about the case, discussing what folks got right and what, according to Bob, they got wrong. And apparently a lot of people got it wrong. That was part of the joy of working with Bob. He wasn't afraid to tell you what he thought, and he could be quite dogmatic about how the case should be discussed and explored. A consummate stage manager, Bob always wanted to run the show. During the pandemic, for example, we attended numerous virtual events on Italian-American history and culture. He'd call me beforehand so I could assist him with the Zoom or Facebook links. Then we'd hang up, promising to deconstruct the presentation afterwards. It was during those late night calls when he'd talk intensely about the poetry of Sacco and Vanzetti's letters and debate, in his words, the perils of oral history. Just a few weeks before he passed, one event riled him so much that he embarked on a long diatribe defending Columbus against the points I raised, because in his opinion, he was a damn good seaman. To give you a sense of who Bob was to me, I'd like to share some of the correspondences he sent to me over the years. I first met Bob through Jerry Kaplan while I was on a research fellowship at Harvard. And when I contacted him by email to request a meeting, he replied, "Hi, Michele. I usually prefer meeting someone for the first time in person than by phone," making it clear to me from the onset that my friendship with him would be hard-earned. I appreciated Bob's willingness to track down answers to the many questions I asked him. Michele, forcing me to look at my old and too overlooked research. He sent me numerous files and links accompanied with comments like, "Rather bland accounting here, nothing particularly new," or "Here is a thesis probably not worth reading." Bob was also not afraid to make outrageous requests, such as the time he wrote, "While drinking my grappa, a flash of light hit me. I am shameless. Your mentioning a trip to Italy brings to mind a wonderful possibility. Do you think you could bring back several copies of La Salute in Boy? I even have a chemist who will analyze the validity of its contents." Bob's emails always contained a clear purpose. My dear Michelle, you seem to have socialized a bit at the Dante. I was so busy that I did not even see Robert Knox. Tell me, what do you think of his book, Soissons Lane? Ever the one to keep the conversation going, he would write, hope we may see each other face to face soon, so that our disagreements may be seen more clearly. Bob effortlessly became a part of my world, not just in terms of research, but in all things Italian. We talked about using the best tomatoes in our sauce, San Marzano, he'd insist, and shared memories of the old country, asking, can one ever return to the South happily? We met in Boston on many occasions, walking the streets in the North End as we talked, and that's when he would reveal his unique sense of humor, warning me to never trust a woman out of the kitchen. Then again, while discussing the work of Tina Modotti, he'd ask me, Lady Gaga and Madonna, do you include them in your list of Italian-American radicals? I liked that he would tell me to listen to the real stuff, opera, and that he always signed off his emails to me with the phrase, hastily but affectionately. Bob was truly anguished by the loss of the arts and his friends during this past year. Menage, right in the middle of Grappa country, he said about the COVID lockdown in northern Italy. Like all of us, his world, in his final months, became smaller and full of dark days, as he put it. This is the Bob I knew. He was reflective and generous with his time, and I'm grateful for his input on my work and for the people he brought together to continue his efforts to memorialize Sacco and Vanzetti. In his last email to me, he wrote, Michelle, sitting here in solitary isolation, as I am sure you are. What do I do but bulk download possibly relevant files? It is this image of Bob ever searching that I will remember and cherish the most.
Great. Thank you so much. We're going to move on to our next speaker. It is a playwright, a filmmaker, a poet, and a peace and social activist. He has received a series of awards, among them first place playwriting from the Massachusetts Artists Foundation for his work, The First All-American President. He got the Blue Ribbon for the film. A good example, Bertolt Brecht and HUAC from the American Film Festival. He was also honored by the Community Church of Boston with the Sacco and Vanzetti Social Justice Award. Last September 2020, David completed writing a historical novel about the Sacco and Vanzetti trial, 1920-1927. David, a pleasure. Go ahead, please.
Hello, I'm going to be reading from a play that Bob wrote in 1998, titled Sacco and Vanzetti, Voices from the Past. I will be reading three characters, one an old anarchist, and then Bartolomeo Vanzetti and Nicola Sacco. We start with the old anarchist. Queste sono le parole. These are the words of our great poet of anarchism, Pietro Gori. He sowed the seeds of rebellion and social justice for so many young minds. How his words made us feel the great pleasures and the brute injustice of life. Date fiori. I remember when Bartolo, he showed me these words that he put into English for one of our American comrades. Give flowers to the rebels failed, to the vagrant poet who dies. Date fiori. Bartolomeo. He was the one who had the way with words. I remember like yesterday what he said. Vanzetti. My life cannot claim the dignity of an autobiography. Nameless in the crowd of nameless ones, I have merely caught and reflected a little of the light from the dynamic thought or ideal, which is drawing humanity towards better destinies. Arrived in America, I underwent all the sufferings, the disillusions, the difficulty that come inevitably to one who lands at the age of 20, ignorant of life and something of a dreamer. Old anarchist. Sacco, now he had a different road. He no suffer and wander like Vanzetti. He went like an arrow right to one place, Milford, Massachusetts. Nick was a great heart. He was in love with life and with Rosina. Ah, how he was in love with Rosina. Sacco. I remember years ago on our love day when I bought the first lovely blue suit for my dear Rosina. And that dear remembrance still remains in my heart. That was Primo Maggio, the first day in Milford, Massachusetts. So in the morning, May 1st, 1912, I dressed up with my new blue suit and I went over to see my dear Rosina, and I asked her father if he won't let Rosina come with me in the city town to buy something. And he said yes. So in the afternoon, about 1 o'clock, we both us went in city town, and we went in a big store and we bought a brown hat, a white underdress, a blue suit, one pair brown sock, one pair brown shoe. And after she was all dressed up, I wish you could see Rosina, how nice she looked. But I was never ambitious to buy her diamonds. But I always bought everything that could be natural and beautiful. Sacco and Vanzetti in the Charlestown State Prison death house a few hours before their execution. Friends and comrades, and now that the tragedy of our trial is at an end, be all as of one heart. Only two of us will die. Our ideal, you, our comrades, we live by millions. We have won. We are not vanquished. Just treasure our suffering, our sorrow, our mistakes, our defeats, our passion for future battles, and for the great emancipation. Salute for us all, the friends and comrades of the earth. Old anarchist. Old comrades, can we remember you as you really were, when you were fighting for your life and our ideals? Or do we remember the good shoemaker and the poor fish peddler, symbols that you never were? To become symbols for a social system you could never accept is a mournful end. La salute et voi. You reminded us, but we were not strong enough, brave enough to free you. Now we're ready to approach the millennia, not utopia, but the millennia. Too many people think numbers, the magic of numbers, that is what will solve our problems. But no, it is the will, the act, the love of man and woman. They will save us. The millennia is the dream, but anarchy is real. We live our life from day to day by our principles, our principles. Remember, la salute è sempre in voi. Thank you.
Thank you so much, David. It's absolutely great. With David's presentation, we actually end the program, the scheduled speakers for tonight. And at this point, we would like to actually open up the mics for people to share their memories of Bob, if you wish to do so. For that, we are asking that you actually write up your names in the chat so that we have an order.
Thank you. Yeah, I wanted to ask that the people who have mentioned associations with Bob that involved Sacco Vanzetti commemorations and organizations to talk more about those and to put links to them in the chat, because frankly, my connection with Bob was solely through my own work and through community church. And obviously many of you knew him through many other organizations related to Sacco and Vanzetti, related to anarchism. Can we have some summaries of those and maybe some links to those organizations?
Sure. We can actually talk about the Sacco and Vanzetti Commemoration Society. Richard, I see that you are on. Would you like to say words about the Sacco and Vanzetti Commemoration Society? Let me unmute you. Okay, go ahead.
If my mic is working all right?
Yes, you're fine. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, I worked with Bob a lot with Sacco and Vanzetti Commemoration Society. We put together a video with our Howard Zinn interview and speech, the meeting of Sacco and Vanzetti. And yeah, there's also another YouTube link with our work with him, some of the marches, some of the footage and everything with Sacco and Vanzetti Commemoration Society as a group on YouTube. But yeah, I worked with him a lot, and it was a fun process. It was very different, and he is so in depth with knowledge about the case. It was like we were involving so much that we were tripping over ourselves with the wealth of information, but we came out with that, and we it's just been really great to know him. So sorry so soon. Yeah, he's been really just involved with Sacco and Vanzetti and his mind, and every day, you know, he couldn't keep it out. He kept bringing it up. You could be talking about something else entirely, and he would find some way to relate it back. Like that was the style of shoes that Sacco designed. He'd just turn around and find something. Yeah, he couldn't get it out of his head. It was really, really a big part of the way I related with him, and he, you know, was the depth of knowledge about it. He read everything.
Great, thank you very much, Richard.
Sergio.
Yeah, I'll contribute the links in the tube.
Yes.
YouTube.
May I say that this, I'm going to share this dream that Bob Datilio always had of having some sort of public monument devoted to Sacco and Vanzetti. And this is a rendering of that monument by an architect or an artist in some place like probably Columbus, or maybe some future point, formerly known as Columbus Park. But that is an effort that continues. And right before Bob died, we had a dinner with a couple of North End people who wanted to approach their city councilor about this idea. The idea is still alive, and I want to offer community churches services in whatever way we can in finding people of influence, like say Governor Dukakis or Judge Agnes and others, to help us realize this dream. Public art is always a very difficult challenge to realize, especially if it's something of any kind of controversy, but right, let's do it.
I'm unmuted, I'll be brief. I first met Bob when we were on warring sides of the theater Nucleo Eclectico, which I think was downstairs from the European way back in the early 80s. We were on warring sides of the board of trustees of that theater. So my introduction to Bob was learning about his caustic wit and sharp tongue and everything else. His great sarcasm was there. So I was acquainted with that. He was a good poet. He was a great foe. And then I fell out of contact with him for a few years and got to know him again on more friendlier terms through Joe Torra and that literary group. And we would then often argue, well, he was the Abruzze and I would be the Siciliano. And we would argue about different aspects of our cultures. And of course, Bob was always right and perfect, but I'm just as stubborn as he was. I think one of his main features was being stubborn. So I was just as stubborn in being adamant for Sicilian. So I have a great fondness for his wit and his dedication to what he was doing. That's it. Thanks.
Hi. Bob and I frequently had pizza together in Medford and would argue about Sacco and Vanzetti. My family came from Castelvecchio, up the road from Torre Maggiore, and I have family now in Torre Maggiore as well. I grew up hearing stories. My mother and father were from Milford, Mass. And when Sacco arrived in America, he went straight to Milford and lived with my mother's cousin, next door neighbor, Henry Iacovelli. So my mother sat on Sacco's knee when she was about 3 years old because they were friends and neighbors. I won't go into the details. It's a story. Bob always wanted me to write this, but I would take Bob to Milford. I would show him things that none of the researchers had ever found because they didn't go into the town clerk and look at the archives. They didn't go into the library and look at the reels as I have. And I brought him to cemeteries where Sacco's first daughter was buried that nobody ever wrote about, etc. So we would just have different perspectives about what happened in the early years, and especially in the strike of 1913, something that I'm very familiar with. I do agree that the bias, having been half Italian myself, the bias against Italians was rampant at that time. The Catholic newspapers wrote that all Italians were not Christians, were not Catholics, they were anarchists. So they were vilified in every manner in this part of the country. So Bob and I shared a lot of that information together, and above all, shared a glass of wine, a pizza, symphony, museums, where we would agree to disagree on many things, and just a lovable guy in his crankiness, but you have to be Italian to appreciate that that's perfectly normal. And we would argue with each other with that kind of affection, and it never alienated us. It's just the way our culture is. So thank you for letting me speak and share.
Thank you for your testimony. I think that before we do that, we'll have to silence everybody again so that we can listen to the song correctly. Okay, thank you. Jake, go ahead.
Thanks, Sergio. Yeah, I play in a band called Jake and the Infernal Machine. Unfortunately, a lot of the other musicians weren't able to do this with us, but my wife is in the band as well as my daughter, Bridget, played with us. This is a brand new song. It wasn't written about Bob, but it was, we've lost a lot of great people in the last year, of course, but, in the years before that as well. So this is just another funeral song.
So here's another song for a good one gone too soon. Another rebel hero sent to rest out past the moon. Just another big fella down upon the streets before our feet. How can our hearts keep marching on and never miss a beat? So we dig the grave with guitar chords and pound the ground with drums. In a violin punk coffin worker's soul forever hums. We shower down upon the grave these flower harmonies. None forever heroes left to walk out past But we've got the jokers and the holidays behind our eyes. We'll carry on without you if our now seems impossible. Another ever here a drink, his glass half full. Another ever here has gone, left us on our road. I hope to never write another song, if this is how it goes. Breath, even in moments such as these. But the base of our creation shakes us all till we're free. So look down any alley and in the faces that you meet. Another ever hero walks forever through these streets. Another ever hero's gone, left us on our road. I hope to never write another song, if this is how it goes. Another ever hero's gone, left us on our road. I hope to never write another song, if this is how, if this is how, if this is how it goes.
Great. Thank you very much, Jake. I would like to actually ask now Michelle and then Dean to actually say final words for this memorial, and then I will say goodbye to all. Go ahead, Michelle.
I just want to say thank you to everyone. I didn't expect to say these final words, Sergio, but this was a collective effort. I think this is a lot. It has a lot to do with Bob's influence on all of our lives, our work, and I think we're going to carry it through. I'm really inspired by what we've heard, and I think for me, I feel like there's so many more possibilities. So I don't see this as an ending. I see this as we're going to continue his work, and we're building bridges here together, and that's very exciting.
Again, this group of people here is a tribute to Bob and to his life. And I asked in the original email that folks write up some observations and send them to us at community.church@gmail.com. And those will go in a permanent archive here at the church that we call In Memoriam. We'd really like to remember Bob, especially because of what he did for us, his role in getting us that plaque that's behind us. And so again, I want to thank you all, and I want to remember that let's do a virtual event, maybe sometime this summer, if the coast is clear, according to the scientists, to really, again, I look forward to meeting all of you in person. It's just been an incredible lot of hard work, but also just a wonderful treat to meet all of the folks that I talked to on the phone and that I organized with over Zoom around the passing of this wonderful figure, Bob Datilio, who most of you knew a lot better than I did. But obviously, this is a life that made a difference, made an impression. And I will be in touch, reaching out to you to organize some sort of event. Maybe it can involve Italian food and grappa, which I've never tasted before, and other wonderful things that Bob obviously enjoyed the finer things with a passion that most of us probably don't even understand. And his his commitment to art, to music, to theater, to dance through his wife, and to scholarship is just phenomenal.
Thank you.
That's all I have to say, and thank you again, and let's be in touch, and long live Bob Datilio presente, is how we say in Central America.
Yes, thank you. And for my part, it's been a pleasure. And thank you all for your discipline, for helping to carry this long program along. Forgive all of the technical difficulties. Fortunately, there weren't too many this time. And as somebody said, good night and good evening. Goodbye.
We declare the meeting over, but the struggle continues. A luta continua.